Peace really comes from a story my dad used to tell about almost shooting this Italian old man. Uh, and he would tell it as a funny story. I mean, he would accept the horror at the center of it was that the old man, they um, enlisted this poor guy, this old guy, who did come up in a cart and to guide them up this very steep hill to get a look at where the road was curving around to the right to see what the Germans, if there was a column waiting or whatever. And on the way there, my father told the story, they came upon a German officer by his uniform with a bullet hole right in the middle of his forehead. And he would tell how the old Italian guy, reached, put his hand back, like, you know, and everybody got down, and then very slowly they came up on it, and there he was. And they went past him. He easily 3 or 4 days dead. And they went on, and then they saw they could see an orderly retreat, and they went back down. And then the guy, the lieutenant, I want to say his name was Black or something like that. I made it a Sergeant Glick, um, who was it Glick? I can't remember now. Um, anyway, the sergeant or lieutenant told my father, take him off in the woods and shoot him. And my father would tell about how, I said, what? What are you talking about? He took us up there. What? Shoot them? He says, yeah, they're spies. We can't trust anybody. And he would talk about how Salerno was so awful because the Germans had indeed found a way to get a hold of American uniforms, and they had infiltrated the American lines and were killing people from behind. And pretty soon, he said, people were shooting their own from behind because they were just shooting everything that moved. They were all so scared. And so this, lieutenant said, take him off down in the woods by the river and shoot him. And Dad talked about the argument he had with him, saying, I'm not going to, sir, and how the old man figured it out and started to say the Hail Mary. And my father recognized, being a devout Catholic, recognized the Hail Mary in the other language. And then the guy pissed himself. He was so terrified. And he would tell that, and he would say how somehow the man pissing himself was more horrible than the things he'd seen at Salerno and these other places. I mean, he was in the murder rolls 4 damn times in Africa, and then at Palermo, and then Salerno and Anzio later. Um, but he would say how he took that guy down in the woods. And then the funny part was that he wouldn't run. He was so scared he wouldn't run. And my dad would say, I'm going, Via, goddamn you, Via, go, And he fired a shot into the ground and said, go, you dumb fucker. And then he said I came this close to killing him because he wouldn't run. And everybody would laugh nervously, and he would smile and say, what a species we are. And then later, when he told about having been wounded and this German soldier, that made the newspapers, putting his arm over and taking him back to the American lines and surrendering. He talked about how when he saw that it was a German soldier coming up to him, the 2 guys with him had been horribly killed. He said this tremendous sense of peace settled over him and said, here it is. This is it. And so I wrote it as a story. I wrote a short story about it. I don't remember what it was titled, but I showed it to him. I was 24, and he said, no, I don't agree, which made me laugh. It sounded like I'd handed him a proposal. But then he said, it wasn't like that. He said, hell, the day before we overturned a cart and a German soldier and a Kraut horse fell out. And they could have killed a couple of us before we got a hold of them. But we got a hold of them and took them to prison, the prisoners camp. But so one night I had finished a long story called, a long work on a fairly long story called The Heart Department in Love. I was in Memphis sitting in this little workspace that I had and realized that there was only a thin pane of glass separating me from 24 degrees. And I went and crawled into bed, keeping well away from Lisa not to wake her with my cold feet. And started thinking it was end of February and coming up on my dad's birthday, which was in March. And I thought about his death and how it had been 11 years since he died. And then I remember that pass of handing him that story and him not liking it. And I thought, I could write that story now. I'm a novelist. I don't have to hold myself to the, you know. And I got up and went back to the work table, put my winter coat on and wrote until the sun came up. I wrote the first 2 chapters. And even then I wasn't sure it was going to be a novel. But then right quick, I'll tell you, when I went by the shooting of the woman. I was 7 pages past it, thinking that was just one of the things going to lead to the thing of him, taking that guy down and by the river. And I said to myself, wait a minute, what the hell? You can't just go by that. That's a murder. And so then I went back, and then I went back to the very beginning, and the murder is what has already happened as the book opens. And then it just was writing itself. I started it. And the first writing on it was like February 27th, and I finished it on May 1st or something. It went quick. I remember saying to Bobby Ann Mason I know that sounds like name dropping, but I love dropping the names of pals. I'm proud to be their pals. That that day, she was having a lot of serious doubts, and I had taken her by her shoulders and said, are you fucking kidding me? You are Bobby Ann fucking Mason, I said. I hope you don't mind this language. But anyway, she said, we're going to go to this place and have some, eat some dinner and stuff. And I said, I'm going up in the room. I'm working on a novel set in the terrible winter of 1944 called Peace. And she said, I'll go at it. And then Robert Port made a marvelous movie out of it. Here's the only autobiographical thing in Playhouse, other than some stage deals, because my daughter's an actor and we've been going around the theaters. I went on an all soy diet when we were living in Memphis. And I wanted to take off. I had gained back some of the poundage. I was like 15 pounds heavier than I had been, when we arrived in Memphis. So I was at like 199 and I had been at 185. And so I went on this soy diet and developed tachycardia. And I'd had palpitations before. But I remember going in and saying to this nurse, my heart's beating 155 beats a minute, and it's been doing it all morning, and my blood pressure is really high. And so a guy came around and took me into this room and got me to lay down and said, well, so it was an allergy to but here's the thing. While I was lying there and I was in the electrocardiogram, that was running and the blood pressure kept running and it was high and all that. And this doctor came in and said, you have also a small abnormality in your EKG. And I said, what? And he said, it's Bundlebrandt's block. And I said, block? And he said, not that kind of block. It has to do with the circuitry of the heart. It's minor. It isn't anything that is to worry about. It's not life-threatening. He said, I've had it for 10 years. And then he walked past the curtain. And me, with my catastrophic imagination, I thought, I wonder how I'd feel if suddenly he collapsed. So then I went home and I wrote the scene of the guy going into the emergency room, the doctor saying that, and then collapsing with the curtain flying up, and there he is, eyes wide open, looking like he's dead. And the guy saying, was it his block? Was it his bundle? Not really remembering the phrase or how to say it. And I read it aloud to Bobby on the phone. He's laughing like hell, and I'm laughing, writing it. And so that I was started a story about a manager of the Shakespeare Theater who felt something funny in his heart, and who had, you know, was his wife has told him she's thinking of leaving him, and that was going to be the story, and he was going to go in, and this was going to happen. But the more I wrote on it, the more I thought about really what the possibilities were in terms of the relationships. And then there was another story I was working on when I was in London about a guy whose, whole life has fallen apart because he was in an accident with his niece, and both of them were drunk. And that had been something that happened, that I sat on a grand jury in Virginia about a guy and his niece. And so that started to perk, and I felt, wait a minute, he's one of the characters in this thing. And I was calling it Glorious for the longest time. I don't think I changed the title to Playhouse until the very last draft, or maybe the draft before that. I did a lot of moving around, though. I mean, I remember moving Malcolm closer to the beginning because it felt as if he came along like I was shifting just because it needed a shift, and it wasn't really that way. Lear has always been one of my favorite plays. I actually will ride along in a car and keep myself awake doing that great speech when he comes to blind Gloucester and Edgar, and it begins with him saying, "They cannot touch me for coining. I'm the king himself." Nature's above art in that respect. There's your press money. And I would say these things because it dawned on me saying them. The more you say Shakespeare, the more you see in it. There's a space right in the middle of that, just after he said, look, a mouse, piece of toasted cheese will do it. There's my gauntlet. I'll prove it on a giant. Bring it the brown bills. Well flown bird, the cloud. And he looks at Gloucester and says, Goneril with the white beard. And then for like 9 lines, he's exactly lucid and sane. They flattered me like a dog, told me I had the white hairs in my beard ere the black ones are there. To say aye and no to everything I said aye and no to was no good divinity. When the rain came to wet me once and the wind to make me chatter, when the thunder would not peace at my bidding, there I found him. I mean, it's exactly what happened to him. They flattered me like a dog, he says, and then he goes back to it, observe that, and he goes on about, handy dandy, which is the thief, which is, the whole thing is all, well, in fact, Edgar says, pertinency mixed with madness or something like that, how appalling it is, you know. But imagine being a writer so goddamn good that you could do that. You could just do that. But anyway, you know, for me, I make jokes about it a little bit because Hemingway said it that way, but I always say Shakespeare's the number one all-time champion. There's just no getting around it. There's nothing evolutionary about writing, you know. If I can't see them, I'll draw them because I could always draw. And I have done that sometimes just to see, just to, you know, but that's really rare. I mean, it's happened maybe 2 times, 3 times. Um, but but I do see it. It's as if I'm looking at a movie in my head, really. But I'm also trying to be there in the sense of what's it feel like on the nerves, you know, how do things, and it's just a technique thing you can talk about in workshop, but it's really hard to do. You have to develop it as a habit, as you know. Is it just um, involving all the senses, you know? I used to love to talk about how Rodin doesn't give a shit what you think. He wants your nerve endings.